Good morning to everybody. I see that we've got participants busy jumping in, so we are just going to give it a moment for people to join. Morning, Ampi. I see Ampi's there. Morning, Brian from Uganda. I see some names still piling up, so we'll give it a moment. And I think just make sure that we've got a decent amount of people before we start. Morning, Ginger. I'm not sure if it's Ginger or whether it's Quill, but good morning. Gituku, good morning out of Kenya. I'm recognizing some of the names. Lawrence Gagne, morning, Lawrence. I know you can't read back, but good morning either way. Just going down the list a little bit. Samuel, Sam, as far as I remember, you are from Ghana, from EcoBank. Good morning. Good morning, Ruth. I see we've got a fair amount of Nigerian colleagues, definitely quite a few from Zimbabwe currently, a couple from South Africa. So we're just going to allow another moment or two. The numbers are still picking up before we kick off. And it's great to see very wide representation from across the continent this morning. So I'm going to start so long and just do a short introduction from my side. And I'm going to ask Nicholas to do the same before we jump off with the content. So my name is Dion de Swart. I'm one of the managing partners and founding members of Africa People Advisory Group, or as we like to call ourselves, APAG. I'm based in the most beautiful of Cape Town, which is quite windy today when I look outside. But it's great to spend some time with you. And I'm going to hand over to Nick, that will do a very, very brief introduction from his side as well. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Dion. And again, good morning, everyone. A lot of familiar names across the continent. My name is Nicholas Constantinides, also a founding member and manager partner at APAG. I find myself based out of Pretoria on a very gloomy, windy, rainy morning, but excited to get into the conversation and having a fruitful webinar with all of you.
Thanks so much, Nick. So just as a brief introduction, if you aren't yet following our LinkedIn page, there's just an indication of where you can find us. So we'll invite you to follow our LinkedIn page. We try and post at least 2 to 3 times a week, and we cover a variety of topics. So it would be great to also connect with you and to engage with you on LinkedIn. We're in the process of starting to think for our planning for next year, what we're going to cover in terms of webinars and insight studies. And I will be posting some questions on the LinkedIn page just to get some insights of what our clients and prospective clients would like to cover there. So I think we only have an hour, so I'm going to kick off. I'm sure more people will be joining. We've got about 82 people on the line currently. We've had about 400 registrations, so let's see where we end. But I think I'm going to start very slowly to cover some content in the meantime. Right, so just a little bit about ourselves. We recently had our 3rd birthday on the 14th of November. We turned 3, and we're really, really excited by the prospect of growing further and doing more work across the continent in coming years. So what are we going to cover today? Today really is an introductory conversation to the world of human resources or workforce metrics and analytics. So we're not going to cover very deep depth and detail. It really is just going to be an introduction to the concept. And if there's further interest to engage with us around some of the conversation, some of the topic, please feel free to chat to us. Then we're going to switch over after we've done an introduction to talk a little bit about getting the right impact with HR metrics and analytics. And then we're going to connect it to new ways of working. So we do an annual thought leadership study called New Ways of Working. We did our 2nd version this year. And what I wanted to do is to share some content around skill building in metrics and analytics in this particular one. And then we'll share some closing remarks in our final conversation. I'm going to be switching off my camera just to make sure that I'm fully focused and I'm not looking at myself whilst I'm presenting. And I will be covering part of the webinar, and part of it will be covered by Nicholas. So let's get started with an introduction. Right, so we in our organization, we often present and run training on the introduction to metrics, and we came across this quote by Edward Deming that we absolutely love. And I think it applies equally to the business as it does to the human resources and human capital profession. And it says, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And for me, it is so exceptionally powerful, because especially so in the human resources profession, we have often made decisions and recommendations on gut feel, because we are the people. You know, we've got this kind of foundation of psychology supporting us. And so often we've been able to just get the business influenced without necessarily using the right level of data. And I think that world has changed fundamentally. So we really loved this particular quotation. I'm going to play a short video just to give you an introduction from an external perspective of what we believe metrics and analytics is all about. I'll ask you, Nick, just to confirm that the sound is working fine.
Hi, today we will discuss what HR analytics is and how it can help in managing human resources. So stay tuned. Now, before we outline the importance and value HR analytics can add to organizations, let's first define what HR analytics is. Human resource analytics is a data-driven approach to managing people at work. HR analytics, also known as people analytics, workforce analytics, or talent analytics, is about analyzing people data to answer critical questions about your organization. Some example questions include, how high is your annual employee turnover? How much of your employee turnover is regretted loss? Do you know which employees will be the most likely to leave your company within the next 12 months? All of these questions can only be answered using data. Now, most HR professionals can easily answer the first question concerning the annual turnover rate. But answering the second question about which part of the turnover is regretted loss becomes more difficult. To answer this second question, you would need to combine two different data sources: your Human Resources Information System, HRIS, and your Performance Management System. To answer the third question regarding which employees are most likely to quit, you would need even more data and more extensive analysis as well. Currently, even though HR departments have a tradition of collecting vast amounts of HR data, unfortunately, these data often remain largely unused. However, as soon as organizations start to analyze these data, they are now engaged in HR analytics. So, in other words, HR analytics is a data-driven approach towards human resources management. Now that we've defined HR analytics, the question that we'll answer next is, how does it help human resource management? Just like marketing analytics has revolutionized the field of marketing, HR analytics is changing the way people are managed in a significant way. First of all, by using people analytics, you don't have to rely on gut feeling anymore. Analytics enables HR professionals to make data-driven decisions and helps them test the effectiveness of HR policies and interventions. In short, HR analytics allows you to make better decisions using data, create a business case for HR interventions, test the effectiveness of these interventions, move from an operational partner to a tactical or even strategic partner. You see, today, the vast majority of HR departments focus on simply reporting employee data, but this alone just doesn't suffice anymore in today's data-driven economy. Mere record keeping is most often insufficient to add strategic value. A prominent American businesswoman and political figure, Carly Fiorina, once said, "The goal is to turn data into information and information into insight." This directly applies to HR. Turning data into insight enables HR to become more involved in decision-making on a strategic level. And in doing so, it adds value to your organization by enhancing its efficiency and effectiveness.
Right, so it looks like the video is stopping at that point in time. We're close to the end of it. And what we'd like to do is to run a very quick poll. And one of the conversational points we often have in workshops is, what is the difference between workforce metrics and HR metrics, if there are any differences? So I'm going to be launching a poll, and we'd love for you to participate and see what you think the differences are. So the poll should be opening, and the first one says, what is the difference between workforce metrics? They're basically the same thing as the first option. The second option, they're different, but interrelated concepts. Workforce metrics is about the performance of the business, while HR metrics is about the performance of the HR function. And lastly, workforce metrics is about the performance of the HR function. And you can see there's a bit of a repeat on the final one. So let's give it a moment. Let's see how far we progress. We're on about 16, 17% completed. Let's see what the feedback is from the audience. I'm going to allow it to get to about 60 or 70% in the interest of time. We're on about 45%. Let's see how we progress. Right, we're getting closer to about 60%. We've got 118 people on the line just out of interest. So the numbers continue to grow. And I'll give it another second or two. We're on 60, close on 70% completed. I'll stop it at 70, right? So we're on 70, and let me share the results. So the first one, they are basically the same thing, 6%. They are different but interrelated concepts. 49, I think a good guess there. Workforce metrics is about the performance of the business, whilst HR metrics is about the performance of the HR function. And that is indeed the correct one. So 36% of votes correct. And I think by default, 49 comes into play. So there definitely is an element of being interrelated as well. Now, let's go on and talk a little bit about the key differences between these two and why we think, you know, they are quite different in nature. When we look at HR metrics, you know, it really is about the cost of the HR function, and it's really upstream from the business strategy. It's very much focused on operational control of the HR function. So the question that we always ask is, who actually cares about HR metrics? It's probably to a lesser extent the Exco team, and to a large extent the HR director, chief HR officer. So it's all about getting the function of human resources right, and it's foundational and fundamental to managing the function. I always look at decks that are prepared for Exco meetings, and HR teams are talking about, you know, the number of HR people to business people, the cost of the HR function. And the question that I always have is, are we getting the same from the finance function, from the marketing function, from operations? So to put it bluntly, I doubt that the business cares about HR metrics, but HR should absolutely care about it. Whereas workforce metrics is about the value to the business. It's all about understanding the business outcomes and the business strategy. It's about focusing on strategic control, having a good handle on all the people metrics across your organization. And it's foundational to managing the business effectively. So it includes things like, you know, turnover rates. It's things like employee engagement numbers. It's all about the cost per employee, the profit per employee, you know, the male to female ratios, whereas HR metrics is about, you know, what's the cost of HR? How many HR people do we have to line people? So it's really important that we differentiate between the two. Now, a little bit of a history lesson. If we look at the kind of phases of HR metrics, I want to quickly talk you through how this discipline has evolved. Discovery was between 1911 to 2010. And what this really meant is that it's a discipline that was starting to emerge and starting to be established. Realization was between 2010 and 2015. And what we started seeing is that there's a foundation of knowledge and models and practices that started developing between 2015 and 2010. The age of innovation was between 2015 and 2020. And so this really is where we saw a lot of new models, new jobs were emerging in the discipline, new technologies started to be used and to be developed. And once we have that foundation in place between the second and the third phase, we're now in the phase of value. So organizations and C-suite leaders are starting to see the value of working with HR metrics and workforce metrics. And this is beyond the normal state of just doing an HR report. And of course, like with any discipline, eventually where we want to get to is to a phase of excellence, where we will mature the discipline to an extent that it becomes a standard function in many organizations. Now, there's a simple graph here, which is a Google Analytics slide. And this just looks at the search for the term people analytics as reflected by Google. And if we take it back kind of Jan 2004, just up to July 2020, what we can see is a significant uptick in the interest around looking at people analytics and people data. So we can see it as it's a field with significant interest, even just if you look at a search on Google Analytics. Now, where does workforce metrics fit into the broader plan of human capital? And this is a graph, and I think, you know, one can argue about specific positioning, but this is a graph that shows us the complete human capital value chain. And when we start looking at how different disciplines pan out in terms of, first of all, on the horizontal slide, what is the strategic value? And on the vertical axis, what is the level of complexity? Then we find things like, HR admin and employee record keeping sits very, very low as far as the value and also as far as the complexity. And that's why I think it's the kind of field that you start seeing moving towards self-service. HR metrics, which is our normal monthly report, kind of sits more or less in the middle. Whereas when we look at proper workforce planning and analytics, it sits just short of HR strategy. And so I want to be very clear that when we are talking about analytics and planning, we're not talking about doing a monthly HR report. The HR report fits into HR metrics in the middle. And of course, what we can see is that it creates a movement from transactional HR to strategic HR. Now, this is a very well-known measurement continuum in the field of workforce analytics that I briefly want to talk through. And when we work with organizations in this particular space and we deliver training, we often say to them, what we want you to be able to do is to move up in this particular curve. So let me quickly talk through the curve. On the left-hand side, you'll see on top, we're describing what is happening. It's the blue section. Whereas where we want to end is the why and where is it happening. On the left-hand side, it's very descriptive. We're kind of talking about a problem that exists already. Whereas on the right-hand side, we want to get to a more predictive state. So let's look at the curve. It starts with anecdotes and reactive checks. An example of a reactive check is that we would sit in an exco meeting and a manager could say, I think that we're losing a lot of experienced salespeople. And we aren't able to answer that question from an HR perspective in that call or in that meeting. So what we do is we jump out of that meeting and we do a whole bunch of investigation to see if that proposed observation is correct. So it's very reactive in nature. Where most organizations are at is an ongoing reporting. So we do a monthly report, sometimes a bi-monthly report, and we actually produce a huge amount of reports and often find that many of these reports don't make it into exco meetings because we kind of moved out due to time, or in many cases might not be used at all. And so we really need to start looking at the efficiency of doing monthly reports and what's the value add. Now, when you progress from reporting, we get into segmentation and comparison. And segmentation and comparison is about slicing and dicing. So instead of just looking at turnover, let's look at the turnover of high potential females as an example. Then we get to correlation, which often requires you to benchmark against the external market. So if I am in my company on 6% turnover, how do I know whether that's good or bad? That's where correlations come in, as how does it compare to other organizations? Where we want to end is simulation and forecasting and causation. Now, I always tell the story that in one of my previous firms, I worked with a colleague in Asia, and they did a project in Asia where with 3 years of payroll and HR data, they were able to predict with 70 to 80% accuracy who will be the next person that will resign in your organization by name. That is when we start getting to predictive analytics. And, we can then also make a decision whether we want to intervene or not. Because if it's a highly talented person, we might want to intervene. But there is also a level of turnover that is healthy in many organizations to get new and fresh people in. Now I'm going to shift over and start to talk a little bit about the levels of workforce insight. And there really are 4 levels of maturity when we start looking at working with workforce metrics, analytics, and insights. And I'll deal with each of these in a little bit of detail, but we start at budget-driven headcount planning, which is right at the bottom. From there, we typically move on to dashboarding and a level of analytics. Then we get to strategic workforce planning. And many organizations that I've seen have not yet made the switch to strategic workforce planning. Often we struggle with the skills. We don't have the right kind of tools to do that kind of work, but it is quite critical to be able to understand the need for the right kind of talent into the future. And then finally, predictive analytics. Now, budget-driven headcount planning, at its core, it's about understanding your headcount. So you can see that example usually in the form of a table, it might be a scorecard, and it's very basic numbers. What is the head count? What's your average age? We look at things like turnover rates. We might look at tenure. And often organizations don't progress beyond this because they might not have the skill or they might not have the right level of technology in place. Now, when we move to the second stage, which is your dashboards and some basic analytics, this is all about slicing and dicing. So in one of the previous pages, I referred to that correlation. This is about slicing and dicing the information. So at this level, we really focused on that alignment between the business strategy and the people strategy. We're starting to use, technology a lot better. And we've got a basic focus on human resources, but also human capital, which is your broader workforce, focus area. We're also starting to look at a basic flow of talent. So we look at, who has entered the organization from a recruitment perspective. We look at promotions and demotions and lateral moves. And we also look at exit. So that's where we start looking at things like dashboarding. And here, tools like Power BI become really important and powerful in being able to slice and dice very, very effectively. But at this point in time, we still don't have the right level of insight. So we know what is happening, but we don't know why it is happening. So let's move on to strategic workforce planning. So strategic workforce planning is about understanding the need or the demand for talent into the future. In strategic workforce planning, we focus on critical workforce segments. Typically, when you do strategic workforce planning, we don't look at all employees and all jobs. We want to understand what is the 10 or 15% of jobs in our organization that gives us a strategic and competitive edge. So as an example, a couple of years ago, we worked with a large bank in South Africa, and they had started to introduce a strategy of digitalization. And so some of the jobs that were present in the technology division were critical to the future of their strategy. And the work that we did for them was to understand what are the key roles in technology that you need into the future? What do you have and what can you build? What sits in the open market? And what is your demand for the future and how do we fill that gap? So it's all about understanding the gap between the talent that you have and the talent that you need into the future. That's where strategic workforce planning comes in. Now, what we often find is really sophisticated technology to support this. But if you haven't bedded down the methodology, it becomes highly problematic. So I'm going to give you a very simple example of strategic workforce planning in action. And yes, this is not a big strategic role, but in the context of this organization, the role of the teller was really important to understand. Now you can see that there's a purple line in the graph on the right-hand side. So in this particular organization, in a bank, they were looking at introducing technology that would reduce the demand for tellers at a branch level. And you could see that natural attrition, looking at past attrition rates, would take them effectively from roughly 2,800 to 1,800 over a 4-year period. But with the introduction of technology and the introduction of automation, they needed a much more aggressive decline in these kind of numbers. So you can see that they created a green line, which is the expected outcome. A very aggressive approach would have been the blue outcome, which said we only needed 120. And the black line gives them a not so successful or a worst case scenario implementation of the initiative. Now, what we can see is that we are still going to sit with a significant oversupply of tellers for this particular organization. And they can then decide what is the right kind of intervention to introduce to avoid retrenchment. Do we reskill? Do we outplace people? Do we offer voluntary severance as an example? And this is where strategic workforce planning fits in. Now, predictive analytics is all about being able to effectively predict the future. So this is all about modeling, looking at complicated statistical techniques and being able to predict what will happen into the future. In a very simple slide, what I want to talk through from a theoretical perspective in predictive analytics is we need 2 factors or 2 items or 2 dimensions to correlate. That's the starting point. So when we look at something like tenure and turnover, what we want to say is there a correlation? Is there a connection between these two items? And first of all, we can tick to say that there definitely is a connection between tenure and turnover in this particular case. The second thing that we want to do is we want to see if there's any kind of time direction where the one precedes the other one. Now, in this particular case, we could see the tenure precedes turnover. What we then do in predictive analytics is we bring in a whole bunch of other factors to then start looking at where is the closest correlation. So we would bring in things like age, like span of control, like location, to then prove where is the strongest connection. In this particular one, we were able to say the strongest connection to tenure is still turnover, and not age, and not span of control, and not location. So this really is at its very core how we work with predictive analytics. Now, as an example, one of the case studies that we often speak about in the US is a call center that was struggling to recruit high quality graduates, because as they were recruiting graduates, the graduates would leave again. And it had a really, really large impact on the organization. When they started bringing in different talent pools and they started applying predictive analytics, they found out that the best and most suitable call center agents were ex-convicts. So totally against prediction, they stopped actually then recruiting graduates and started recruiting a very different kind of person to come and work in their organization. The very last item that I briefly want to talk about, and I just want to kind of pique your interest, is something called organizational network analysis. It's a very, very busy slide. Don't worry about that too much. What organizational network analysis does is it looks at the flow of communication within an organization. So without necessarily looking at the content of emails, what you can do through ONA is to look at how people communicate with each other. Now, in the example on the left-hand side, right in the center, you'll find the name Pankaj. And what we find in this particular organization is that Pankaj is the most reached out person in this particular team or in this particular organization. Now, what would be interesting to see is what is the formal role that Pankaj would hold. He might not be a leader or a manager. He might be just a highly inspirational kind of lower level employee that has a really great network and getting work done. On the right-hand side, another example, you can see that there are two people here, Salman and Roy, that are totally, totally disconnected from this organization. From a communication perspective, looking at the flow of email. Now, part of the problem here is that you might find like a Salman or a Roy could be leaders in the organization. And so they sit exposed because there could be some question marks around the credibility and the trust coefficient as far as the leaders of the organization are concerned. So this is some of the newer thinking around ONA, which we wanted to drop in just to give you a sense of interest. I'm going to be handing over to Nicholas, and Nicholas will be leading with the next section.
Thank you very much, Deon. So how do we start getting the right impact with HR metrics and analytics? And I want to take us back to the fundamentals in getting started on the journey. So I found an article written by a gentleman called RJ Milner, who's the global head of people analytics at Uber, an organization that I think we can all agree fundamentally driven by data and analytics thereof. And what he looked at was a couple of pointers in helping organizations and individuals getting started with metrics and analytics. And some of those pointers are as follows. So the first point was around getting the lay of the land. And this really spoke about dedicating time to learning about the business, its needs, and identifying key stakeholders in the organization and building relationships with them, trying to understand what's going well and what isn't, and then trying to focus on figure out why. The second point was really around identifying quick wins. And this speaks about that low-hanging fruit, those quick wins that we're able to identify and do the math, understand the cost and benefit analysis, and run with them at the beginning to gain traction and momentum. The third point spoke about not neglecting infrastructure. And I think in a day and age where data privacy and security is at an all-time high and a key element of interest for individuals and organizations. And it's important that us as an organization ensure that our policies are accurate and compliant. If we think of ourselves here in South Africa with the likes of the POPI Act and our colleagues in Europe with GDPR, it's important to ensure that we get it right at the beginning and build it out over time, rather than potentially having to pause everything and overhaul an entire system if a problem arises. The fourth step, and this is something that you'll probably hear myself and Dion reiterate a couple of times in the session, it's not worrying about having your data 100% clean. And of course, what we're saying is that you shouldn't do your best to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible, but sometimes there will always be gaps. And your data, although not perfectly clean, shouldn't stop you from using it. So how do we change the way we think about metrics and analytics? Currently, if we think about the process that we often follow, we go out and collect data. We then select our metrics and we spend an inordinate time in analyzing the data and then ultimately sharing our findings with our stakeholders and in some instances, assessing the impact. But what we're saying is that instead of starting with what data we have available, we need to start with the end goal in mind and determine that impact or problem statement. This then will inform what metrics you use and then what data should be available, and ultimately how we're then able to report and interpret the data. And this is what I want to spend a bit of time on, is unpacking these 5 steps and really getting started on the journey of metrics and analytics. So the first one, if we look at really determining the impact, and it speaks again to RJ Milner's point of really getting a lay of the land. And there's a couple of things that we can do to try and identify the impact. And the first one is really around interviewing our senior leaders and understanding what are their concerns and if there are any potential quick wins. Understanding the people strategy and ultimately how that links to achieving our business goals often helps us in better understanding the flow of talent and of course the causes that might come from it. So once we've determined the impact and our problem statement, we then move on to choosing our metrics. And there really is a plethora of different metrics that we can utilize in identifying and understanding particular problems in our organization. And what I've looked at here in front of us is just if we focused on a typical employee life cycle from hire to exit, and then slice that information utilizing 4 key types of metrics, namely cost, time, volume, and quality. And if we look at it from a higher point of view, really trying to understand the cost aspect, we want to know what the cost per hire is, whether it be from a recruitment and time point of view. If we look at time, how long does it take us to fill a typical role in our organization? Volume, what is the total number of requisitions or applications that we receive for any particular role? And are we measuring this data? And very importantly, what is the quality of our hires in our organization? And are we measuring what the quick quit rate is? So just to share additionally different examples of metrics that we can utilize, just looking at the employee life cycle. Another example that we could look at is on the reward aspect. And if we want to fundamentally understand from a cost perspective, we could probably look at what the average salary is by grade or by role in our organization. We could also potentially try and calculate what the comp ratio is of an individual when we try and then compare it to any sort of market data. Volume, as an example, helps us understand how many employees might potentially be below, within, or above our pay ranges in our organization. So once we've identified the metrics that we want to work with, we then need to go out and start collecting our data. So what I want to do is to launch a quick poll and try and understand from yourselves, where do you typically source your data when you need to then begin your analysis, particularly around metrics and analytics? Do you fundamentally rely on your HRIS system? particular HR business partner reports, client or line feedback reports, general market data, or any specific business unit metrics that you might look at. So I'm going to give it a couple of seconds. We have about 30% feedback. I'm going to wait till about just over 50. All right. And then I'm going to share the feedback with us. So just briefly looking at it, I think understandably, the majority of us collect our data from our HRIS system. And if we have an integrated system, we're really able to then collect a lot of data out of one system. And I think the important takeaway from this is that we need to consider the multiple different aspects and sources of data. And are we linking them together? Are we only focusing on an HR function or HR point of view? Or are we starting to link finance data and sales data with our people data in our organization? So how do we get onto the journey of collecting our data? And one thing is for sure is that poor quality data can really derail any sort of analytics efforts. And our stakeholders often spend more time questioning the data than we actually use to make decisions with the data. So building credibility in your data is key in shifting the conversation. So we need to move away from being questioned, how did we calculate 10% sales manager turnover in our organization, and rather progress the conversation to what does it actually mean to have 10% sales manager turnover, and understanding and analyzing the data, then rather questioning how the data came about. So again, there's a typical phrase that you might often hear is that we shouldn't worry about being 100% accurate, but rather directionally correct. And there's a few things we can do to help improve the quality of data that we collect in our organization. And the first one is completing a data audit. And that really looks at understanding and identifying where there are gaps in our data. Something I always used to say was that your payroll data in your organization is probably the cleanest set of data, because this is being audited on a monthly basis. And I can guarantee you, if you get something wrong, you will certainly hear about it. But in the recent news about PRASA, the passenger rail agency in South Africa, hearing that they had over $10 million of unaccounted payroll costs due to ghost employees on the payroll, I'm starting to second guess how clean our payroll data actually is. But again, something else that might help is looking at completing a data dictionary. And in essence, a dictionary around how we calculate and measure particular metrics. If we think of our sales manager turnover, what we would look at is, when do we calculate turnover in our organization? At the 1st of the month, or on the 31st of the month? And ensuring that we're able to describe this in our data dictionary and being consistent is key. Then finally, how do we then, ensuring that we complete a data plan, ensuring that we maintain and manage data in the organization into the future and not allow it to stagnate over time. So once we've collected our data, we then need to move on to analyzing our findings. And there's a couple of elements that we need to focus on when analyzing data. And I think this is the section that we probably spend the most amount of our time on. So key that we get it right. The first point that I want to talk about is really understanding the components. And this talks to the measures and the time context that we're using when measuring our data. Do we understand what attributes are being utilized to either segment or compare our data? We then want to translate the data into something a little bit more meaningful. And typically this is with the use of some formulaic calculation. So we move away from how many people left the organization to understanding what percent or turnover percentage exists in our organization. Ultimately understanding what the data does, and more importantly, what the data doesn't tell us. Turnover percentage, as an example, doesn't necessarily tell us why employees are leaving the organization. So at this stage, we can take a step back and understand what additional data sets may be useful, maybe exit interview information, linking that in understanding why employees are leaving the organization, and taking that step back into step 3 around collecting the data and identifying additional sources that we might have missed before progressing on down the rabbit hole. Point 3, want to examine the trends. And this is really around ensuring we compare like for like, and particularly from a time concept. Are we looking at actual data at a point in time, or rather annualized data over 12 months, and ensuring that we're consistent? And this is really where it's key to have that data dictionary in place. Then finally, Dion also reflected on this, was really understanding and considering where there's any relationships in the data. And typically when we're comparing two variables, we talk about the coefficient of correlation. And we want to understand whether there's a positive or negative relationship, and if there's a strong or weak one. Once we've determined whether there is a relationship, we're then able to start isolating and swapping out variables to better understand the data. As an example, if we wanted to determine whether, or if we determined there was a relationship between bonus pay and company performance, as an example, we could then isolate and plug in whether tenure has any impact on the data, whether it's positive or negative. So once we spend quite a bit of time around analyzing our findings, we then need to start thinking about how we start sharing these findings. And I want to talk about two main aspects, focusing on the visualization of the data and ultimately telling a story with the data. So I want to share a brief video that talks about visualizing data and key aspects that we need to consider when visualizing our data.
Let's talk about graphs and how and when to use them. When presenting ideas that include references to data like sales growth or cost reduction or any reference to evolutions in numbers and figures, it can be helpful to make the point using a graph or a chart. These visual methods can make the point much stronger than simply describing the data. Just have a look at these two slides. Which one conveys the message better? Presentation of data is tricky. Most people in your audience simply hate to crunch numbers. So here are 3 secrets to help your audience understand your graphs and charts better. Now, a lot of data is available from Excel or other spreadsheet software, and most presenters have the habit of cut and pasting it from there. Bad idea. Excel files are created for detailed reporting. Most presenters equate complexity of charts with believability of information. That does not work in a presentation. Rule number 1, simplify the data. Think of what you want to convey with the graph on the slide. Is it an increase in turnover, a cost reduction? Is it a higher margin? Showcase only relevant data and kill all the clutter. Cut out everything else. To make the presentation of data effective, remove everything that can potentially distract the audience's attention, like backgrounds, redundant labels, shadows, and 3D effects. Let us look at an example. This graph is far too complex and contains too much information. By deleting the non-relevant information, we get a much more informative slide. Do you see the difference? Sometimes presenters have a favorite chart type and use it all the time. They forget about the basics. Rule number 2, use the right charts. Basically, we distinguish between 3 types of charts. There's a pie chart, the line chart, and the column or bar chart. Pie charts represent proportions or percentages, for instance, man-woman balance at the workplace, or like in this example, cost allocation of a product or service. The second type of charts are line charts. These are perfect to represent trends or an evolution in time. Mostly the horizontal axis is the timeline and the measured value is represented in the vertical axis. Column or bar charts are used to represent ranks under different conditions. For instance, to show the turnover of a product in different regions, much like you can see here. Graphs without a clear focus take a long time to understand. And you know, in a presentation you don't want to confuse your audience, so make your point clear from the very beginning. So here's rule number 3. Make your key point stand out. A lot of presenters expect their audience to do mental math and draw their own conclusions. And this is a great way to lose your audience's attention. A simple yet very effective trick: use the title to reinforce a graph's message. The best graph titles introduce, summarize, and reinforce its message. So remember to keep your graph simple and easy to understand. Instead of using a title like Turnover by Region, you could use this title: North Region has the biggest turnover, which explains your point perfectly. Now, one final thing on graphs. Do not underestimate the importance of colors in a graph. Colors can focus on the right thing, but they can also distract the audience.
So then, just to summarize some of the key 3 aspects raised in visualization of data, whether we're using Excel, Power BI, or Tableau. The first one, thinking about how we share our findings, is simplifying the data and really removing all the clutter and additional data sets. Point 2, use the right chart. Understanding the pros and cons of each chart, knowing that if we want to compare year-over-year data, perhaps a pie chart is not the best use of visualization when we present results. And then lastly, the third point, make your point clear. Reinforce your message, whether it be by the use of subtle annotations or graph titles, guiding the stakeholder in understanding what it is exactly that we want to share. So once we've understood the aspect of visualizing our data, we then want to elevate it and spend the final piece of time in telling a story with the data. So there's a couple of aspects, again, we want to focus on, and 4 key points we need to consider when telling a story with data. The first one is really understanding who you're talking to and our audience. I want you to think about what their aptitude or appetite might be for data. If we think about our CFO, they probably prefer in-depth analysis versus our HR exec, who might prefer succinct or summarized reports. So really understanding whom you're speaking to. Point 2 and 3, starting to craft the story. So what do you want them to understand or do with the information? And more importantly, why should they do it? What are some of the challenges or hurdles that need to be overcome? And are we clear in what decisions should be made and why? Then finally, how do we structure the report and build out the content? And I like using the visualization of a martini or wine glass. If we think about the tip or mouth of the glass, we start off with a broad introduction, creating the context of the information that we're sharing. We then want to narrow it down to a particular point as we move down the stem, and ensuring that we take the audience along with the process. Then finally, as we move towards the base of the glass, we open it up again for interaction and exploration, ensuring that we have that author and reader-driven approach. So to summarize our key steps in getting started with metrics and analytics, really changing the way we look at going along the process, starting off with determining the impact, understanding what the problem is. That then helps guide us in choosing the appropriate metrics, which will then inform the data that we might need to go collect, whether from an HRIS system or finance or sales data. Moving on to analyzing our findings, where I think we spend a good amount of time, but then not forgetting how we ultimately present and visualize the data. And then finally, not forgetting to tell a story with the information. And then I'm going to hand over back to you, Dion, to take us through the third section.
Thank you so much, Nick. So we're heading into our final section, which is all about connecting the new ways of working as we've seen it in Africa to human resources metrics and analytics and workforce metrics. So for anybody that is not aware, we run a PanAfrica study, and you're welcome to just go to our website. You'll find it on the main page at the bottom. There's quite a substantial report that you're welcome to download for free. And it really is about sharing insights in the human resources profession across the continent. So our kind of strapline here is that our aim really is to provide Africa insights from Africa. What we have found with many of the large consulting firms is they produce exceptional content and insights, but often it doesn't reflect the realities of Africa. Or may I say even worse is that we take South Africa as a proxy for the rest of Africa, which is really not fair towards the broader continent. So we've made it our mission to start creating insights for Africa from Africa. So a little bit about this year's study. We had about 30% participation by South Africa, high numbers from Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and a couple of other markets. And we've had, around about 148 companies participate in the survey this year. So you're welcome to visit our website. You can also go to our LinkedIn page. There's many posts that cite this particular report if you want to download it. Now, in this particular report, we also this year looked at what are the top rated skills for human resources professionals in 2022. And what companies were saying is that HR and people analytics is the most sought after skill in terms of the need for development. And very few organizations have actually invested in developing these kind of skills. So you'll see that 35% of participants indicated that we haven't focused on developing at all, whereas 32% have said we've kind of started some kind of plan to develop it. And out of interest, the other skills, business acumen, strategic workforce planning, org design, and then another important one is strategic consulting skills for HR professionals. We then asked participants, well, how do you rate all of these skills in terms of the level of proficiency? And what was really interesting to see, once again, right at the bottom, is that metrics and analytics was rated one of the lowest skills in terms of proficiency. So we can definitely see the need to build more skills in this particular field. So when we then ask companies, well, if you look at the measurement continuum that I spoke about early on, where are you focused? And you can see that if we look at where we need to focus towards the right-hand side, most organizations are still focused on the left-hand side. So 46% of organizations are focused on HR reporting, 5% on reactive checks. And when you start looking at predictive analytics, only 6%, simulation and forecasting, only 5%. So a big need to start shifting the dial as far as the skill set is concerned. So in closing, we really want to thank you for attending the webinar today. We'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. We also wanted to announce that a longer version of this webinar in the form of an e-learning module has been launched in the last couple of days. So if you are interested to learn more, please, you can scan the barcode or you can reach out to us on LinkedIn or just on our email address. And then feel free to connect with us if you are interested, either for yourself or your team, to potentially then complete the full e-learning module. And we do also run this particular session that we had today in a full day workshop. We've run quite a bit of these across the continent. So once again, thank you for listening to us today. You're welcome to join the LinkedIn page, and we want to open up for any questions or comments that there might be in the kind of 5 or 6 remaining minutes. Any questions or comments are welcome. You can just use the comments block or comments box and pop in any questions or comments that you might have. If you've got no questions or comments, you are welcome to also jump off the line. We will make the slides available. We'll distribute it via email. We obviously have everybody that's attended's contact details. So we will be sending out a post-event link to our YouTube channel where you can look at the recording again, and we will also make the slides available for interested parties.
So there's a question, Dion, from Abi asking, where should the analytics department reside in an organization, inside the HR department or outside in other departments? So I think the typical consulting answer is it depends. I think it largely depends on the size of the organization and the maturity. What I've seen is a combination of having it sit as a separate function. Ultimately, I think what's important is that it shouldn't sit in a singular role, and really should be embedded within the organization and helpful to have it across multiple functions, not just within HR or finance, but across the different parts of the organization.
Great, thanks, Nick. Ollie, you can maybe just, I'm not sure if you have yet, but also just pop in our info address if you want to there. There's a question from Linda between Power BI and Tableau. Which one is mostly used for HR analytics and metrics? Nick, I'm not sure if you want to take a stab at this one. It'll be a difficult one to answer.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to take
it's a bit of a subjective answer. It's really, I don't see a clear preference between the two. I see both of them used widely across organizations. I think there's a preference from an IT setup point of view, but I think both have their pros and cons. Both are fantastic in terms of dashboarding and visualization. I think they do a fantastic job around that. But I think it's also important to note that for most of us that just have Excel is an immensely powerful tool. And before we get caught up in wanting the fancy data and software programs, is really starting off simply utilizing Excel, utilizing the analytics that is embedded in the software and building that out.
I see there's a question from Kevin on an unanswered question. I'm just struggling to find the question there. So Kevin, I don't know if you just perhaps want to type it again. We seem to not be able to find it in the questions. You're most welcome to pop it again and we can see if we can, oh, I see it comes up. Has a cost versus benefit analysis been done to indicate the monetary value savings to an organization if an organization implements the HR analytics approach indicated? I mean, I think it'll be very difficult to point to a particular case study, but I think anecdotally, if you look at the kind of work that you want to be able to deliver in the space of workforce metrics, it very often is about creating efficiency in the organization. So my sense would be that if you are focused on the right kind of organizational issues, I have very, very little doubt that you could build a business case for this. So, you know, if you are able to, as an example, to solve issues around retention or the ability to attract the right people or the cost of payroll, you know, in a larger organization, the kind of investment in metrics and analytics, I would imagine would be negligible around as compared to the kind of benefit that you would gather. But I can't cite a particular case where we've looked at a business case. But certainly from the work that we've done, I think there would be, it would be easy to build a business case to show the ability to save money. Right, I am aware that we've got like a minute or two left. I think there's a question there from Daniel around can data analytics be a department on its own? I think, Nick, you've addressed that one, absolutely. In many of the forward-thinking global organizations, you separate the HR reporting function from analytics. Analytics is almost like a SWAT team. You know, they're not bound to a specific cycle of reporting. They are there to go and fix business problems using people data. So absolutely. There's another question here. Thank you so much for the webinar. Does the e-learning provide learnings on statistical analysis like correlation and predictive modeling? Not in any level of detail. So you're welcome to reach out to us and we can give you a sense of what is covered in the e-learning. But the e-learning is still a fundamentals course. So it's about understanding the basics of this. It's not an in-depth course to teach you skills on analytical techniques, just to answer that question. Right, do you offer face-to-face training workshops? We do, if there's sufficient demand for it in a particular country. So what we often do is we work with in-house teams, but if there's sufficient demand for it in a particular country, we can absolutely do it. Okay, right. I think we have effectively run out of time. I know that there's one or two unanswered questions, but we want to be respectful of people's time. So we will endeavor to reach out to individuals with the particular questions, we really want to thank you for your attendance today and looking forward to engaging with you further online. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.